These are 3 things that you shouldn't waste your money on as a beginner photographer. Let's get right into it. The first on the list that I want to tell you about that you shouldn't buy as a beginner photographer are cheap filters. You have a ton of filters out there, graduated filters, and these filters actually have effects from the top to the bottom, all right? So mostly the top has that particular effect, whether it's frosted or whether it's, a little bit darker, mostly used for, landscape photo shoots where you need to, reduce the exposure of the sky and keep the land in a correct exposure. In most cases, you can actually achieve this effect in your editing software like Photoshop and Lightroom or what have you. So you shouldn't even waste your money on this if you're a beginner photographer, and rather invest your money into online courses that you can benefit a whole lot from and understand everything that there is to know about photography very well before you go into purchasing. And mostly beginner photographers want to spend money on a lot of things that might not benefit them, because a lot of people come to me telling me that they have a lot of equipment but they barely use them. And that's because if you overconsume content like gear reviews on YouTube, you'll be convinced that you need almost everything. You're going to be convinced that you need almost everything. So you have to be very careful with the purchasing decisions, especially when it comes to filters. And if you heard me correctly, I didn't just say any filters, but particularly cheap filters, because it's going to degrade your image quality for the most part. Because most UV filters, for instance, that most photographers mount on their lenses to protect them from the sun rays as well as protect the front element, can actually mess up your images. It might reduce the sharpness. It will actually affect the entire image quality for the most part. So you have to be very careful and don't invest in cheap filters. However, if you have the funds to invest in much more expensive and professional filters, I'm going to leave a video that I made previously about filters, and you can check it out and get yourself one. The second on the list are speed lights. You don't need a speed light when you start out in photography. Trust me, unless you're shooting events that, let's say, it goes in the night, or you're shooting indoors where you have to bounce a light against the ceiling for it to fall and, disperse all across, you're not going to need it on a normal day, because hardly will you find a beginner photographer nailing every shot shooting under the sun alone. Using just the sun to light a subject. Many a times you're going to go through a series of trial and errors, and that's where you have to actually master. That's that point where you need to understand the exposure triangle very well, the aperture, ISO, shutter speed, nail each and every single principle, and then you can add yet another light source to add on to the already confusing exposure triangle that probably you might be battling with. So the flash itself is a very good gear to add to your arsenal, but you don't necessarily need it as a beginner photographer, because 9 out of 10 chances are beginner photographers are going to have it mounted on their camera, and they are mostly at risk of overexposing their images. The third gear that you shouldn't purchase as a beginner photographer, or shouldn't waste your money on as a beginner photographer, are cheap tripods. A tripod is meant to help you stabilize your shots. For instance, if you're doing long exposures or basically shooting pictures of yourself, let's say, if you have to have your camera mounted on your tripod to stand away from it and set a timer and take that picture, you might need a tripod. I get it. But do not invest in cheap tripods, because a tripod, as significant as it can be, is one of the gear that you wouldn't want to necessarily spend so much money on. And so beginner photographers find themselves purchasing cheaper ones. And if you purchase a cheaper one, and imagine having a 5,000 USD worth of a camera, and you're going to mount all that on a cheap tripod, chances are that you're going to lose it. You're going to have it fall, tumbling down, and you don't want to have that happen, all right? So do not invest into cheap tripods. Rather, invest in much more expensive ones. And in most cases, you might not necessarily need it, because if you have your camera mounted on a tripod, you quickly have to take an image. For instance, you need to move quickly away from somewhere. Chances are that you might not have that time, all the time in the world, to dismount it and go take that picture just in time. So tripods, if you need it, purchase much more professional ones that are durable, that can have much more stability on the ground. So these are the 3 things that I would advise every beginner photographer. If you are one, don't invest in them, or don't waste your money on them, and you can thank me later. And this brings us to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, share this video across so that a lot of people can also get a bit out of this. And I'm gonna catch you next time. Don't forget to subscribe. See ya.